Victoria Ashford had never missed a deadline, never lost a negotiation, and never allowed a single variable to slip beyond her control. At 38, she sat in Terminal 4 of Denver International Airport with her laptop open, 3 browser tabs running simultaneous conference calls, and a schedule that left no room for deviation. The morning light filtered through the massive windows, casting long shadows across rows of waiting passengers. But Victoria noticed none of it. Her eyes remained fixed on spreadsheets, her mind already 3 time zones ahead in a boardroom she would occupy by noon. The cold efficiency of the terminal matched something inside her, a precision that had carried her from a modest upbringing in rural Ohio to the corner office of one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the country. She checked her watch, calculated, adjusted. Control was the only currency that had never failed her, and she spent it liberally. A few seats away, a man with graying temples and calloused hands observed her without meaning to observe. Nathan Cole was 45 years old, dressed in worn jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. With the unhurried posture of someone who had learned to measure time differently than most people. Something about the woman in the tailored charcoal suit held his attention. Not her obvious wealth or the authority that radiated from her posture, but the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw tightened each time her phone vibrated. He recognized that particular brand of exhaustion. He had worn it himself years ago, before everything changed. The cold morning air, the dry hum of the terminal, the distant shuffle of strangers, it all carried a weight that signaled something was about to shift. The girl appeared from the direction of the restrooms, moving with the careful deliberation of someone navigating a world that rarely accommodated her. Sophie Ashford was 11 years old, with her mother's sharp cheekbones and her father's dark hair, but her eyes held something neither parent possessed, a patience that seemed almost ancient. She had been born deaf, though Victoria had never quite accepted that framing. Sophie had not lost anything. She had simply arrived in the world with a different kind of listening, one that Victoria had spent 11 years failing to understand. Sophie approached her mother and raised her hands. Her fingers moved with precision, forming words in the air between them. She was asking about breakfast, about whether they might have time to get pancakes from the restaurant they had passed earlier. Simple questions, the kind any child might ask on a long travel day. Her face was hopeful, animated, full of the natural expressiveness that sign language required and rewarded. Victoria looked up from her laptop, and something in her expression flickered. Recognition without comprehension. Her daughter's hands were still moving, but the shapes meant nothing to her. She recognized a few signs, the ones Sophie had taught her repeatedly over the years, but they dissolved into confusion the moment Sophie combined them into sentences. It was like hearing words in a foreign language and understanding perhaps 1 in 10. Victoria's own hands remained frozen above her keyboard. Useless. She felt the familiar flush of inadequacy, quickly suppressed. She gestured vaguely toward her bag, where she kept granola bars and fruit snacks for emergencies. Sophie's expression flickered too, something between disappointment and resignation, before she nodded and sat down beside her mother. She had learned to read that particular gesture years ago. It meant no, but in a way that did not require her mother to actually say no, to acknowledge the rejection directly. Sophie pulled the granola bar from the bag and unwrapped it without complaint. She had stopped complaining about these small disappointments long ago. The distance between them was less than 2 feet. It might as well have been an ocean. Nathan watched the exchange without appearing to watch. He had seen this before, more times than he could count. Parents who loved their children fiercely but could not reach them. Children who had stopped expecting to be understood. The gap between intention and connection, widening with every failed attempt. Something in the girl's resigned posture reminded him of his own daughter, many years ago. Before he had finally learned to listen, Sophie pulled out a sketch pad from her backpack and began to draw. Her pencil moved quickly, confidently, creating shapes that seemed to emerge from some private world. Victoria returned to her emails, but her typing had slowed. Something felt wrong. Something she could not fix with phone calls or wire transfers or the careful application of authority. Her daughter sat beside her, perfectly silent, and Victoria had no idea what she was thinking. Nathan closed his book and slipped it into his bag. He had not intended to intervene. He had learned, over the years, that most people did not want help. They wanted validation. But the girl kept glancing in his direction, and there was something in her eyes that reminded him of another time, another silence that had once threatened to swallow him whole. He stood, stretched, and walked toward the coffee kiosk nearby. When he returned, cup in hand, he chose a seat closer to the girl, not intrusively close, just near enough that she could see him clearly if she looked up from her drawing. He set down his coffee and raised his hands. His fingers moved with the fluency of someone who had spent years learning a language most people never bothered to acquire. American Sign Language was not a simplified version of English, not a system of gestures that hearing people could master in a weekend workshop. It was a complete language with its own grammar, syntax, and cultural nuances. Nathan had struggled with it for years, had made countless embarrassing mistakes, had wanted to quit more times than he could count, but his daughter had been patient with him. And eventually, the language had become as natural as breathing. He signed a simple greeting to Sophie. "Hello, I noticed your drawing. That creature looks really interesting. What is it?" Sophie's pencil stopped moving. She looked up at him with an expression Nathan recognized immediately. Shock, followed by cautious hope. In the hearing world, encounters with fluent signers were rare enough to feel almost miraculous. She glanced at her mother, perhaps checking whether this interaction was allowed, then back at Nathan. Her hands rose to respond. The creature was part bird and part dragon, she explained, her movements becoming animated in a way they had not been moments before. She had invented it for a story she was writing, a long narrative about a hidden kingdom and a young queen who could speak to animals. The creature's name was Stellan, which meant star in a language she had read about in a book at school. She had spent months developing its backstory, its abilities, its complicated relationship with the queen, its role as guardian and protector. Nathan asked questions, drawing her out. He commented on specific details in her drawing, praised her shading technique, asked about the story's plot and characters. Sophie responded with increasing enthusiasm, her whole body engaged in the conversation. Her signs became larger, more expressive, filling the space between them with meaning. She laughed at something, he said, a real laugh that seemed to surprise her as much as anyone. For the first time that morning, she was not accommodating a hearing world. She was simply being herself. Victoria looked up from her laptop. Her daughter was laughing. Actually laughing, her face bright with pleasure. Her hands dancing through the air in conversation with a complete stranger. The man's hands moved in response, and Sophie's eyes widened with delight at something he signed. Victoria felt something cold settle in her chest. She did not understand what they were saying. She could not participate. She was sitting 3 feet away from her own child, close enough to touch, and she had never felt more distant. Nathan glanced toward Victoria and saw the confusion on her face. He signed something to Sophie, then spoke aloud for Victoria's benefit. His voice was warm and unhurried. She was telling me about her art project, a creature she invented for a story. It is remarkably detailed work. Victoria seized on the words like a lifeline. Yes, she is very artistic. Her teachers say she has real talent. Sophie signed something quickly to Nathan, too fast for Victoria to follow. He nodded and responded in kind. She says you have never seen the full story, Nathan translated. She has been working on it for 2 years. There are over 40 pages of drawings and notes. Victoria felt the stone in her chest grow heavier. 2 years. Her daughter had been creating an entire imaginary world for 2 years, and Victoria had never known the details. She had seen the drawings, had praised them in the abstract way she praised all of Sophie's work, but she had never asked about the story behind them. She had never entered her daughter's imagination. Sophie turned to her mother and began signing rapidly, trying to include her in the conversation. She was explaining about Stellan, about the kingdom, about the young queen who had befriended the creature. But the signs came too fast, and Victoria's comprehension lagged further and further behind. She nodded at moments that seemed appropriate, smiled when Sophie smiled, but she was performing understanding rather than possessing it, and the performance was obvious to everyone except herself. Sophie's enthusiasm began to dim, her signs growing smaller, slower. She was accommodating her mother's limitations, as she always did, translating herself into something simpler, more digestible. Nathan saw the change and felt the familiar ache of recognition. He had watched his own daughter make the same adjustment years ago, before he finally understood what he was asking her to sacrifice. He signed something to Sophie, then spoke aloud. "I should let you two talk." I did not mean to interrupt, but Victoria raised a hand. "No, please, stay." She seemed so happy. The words were true, and they were devastating. Her daughter seemed happy talking to a stranger. The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Nathan hesitated, then nodded. Sophie watched her mother with patient eyes. Then she signed something to Nathan, slowly and deliberately. "She is asking if I could teach you a few signs," he translated, "so you could understand some of her stories directly." Victoria felt her throat tighten. "I would like that. I would like that very much." What followed was a simple lesson. Nathan showed Victoria the sign for dragon, for story, for kingdom, for bird. Sophie watched her mother's clumsy attempts with patient eyes, correcting her hand positions, demonstrating the movements again and again. For the first time all morning, mother and daughter were engaged in the same activity. Not perfectly, not fluently, but together. Victoria fumbled through the shapes, her fingers refusing to cooperate, her brain struggling to process a grammar that had nothing to do with English. She got things wrong, started over, got them wrong again. But Sophie kept correcting, kept demonstrating, kept waiting with the patience she had developed over a lifetime of being misunderstood. After perhaps 20 minutes, Nathan sensed it was time to step back. He excused himself to make a phone call, giving mother and daughter space to practice without an audience. Sophie continued teaching. Victoria continued trying. The distance between them, for the first time in years, began to shrink. When Nathan returned, Victoria turned to him with an expression that held something new. Vulnerability, perhaps. Or the beginning of humility. "Can I ask you something personal?" He nodded, sitting down nearby. "How did you learn to sign? Was it for work or something else?" Nathan was quiet for a moment, considering how much to share. "My daughter, Emily. She was born deaf. I was an investment banker when she arrived, working 80-hour weeks, convinced that success meant climbing the corporate ladder as fast as possible. I assumed she would adapt to my world. I assumed my wife would handle the communication, and I would handle the providing. I told myself that was fair, that it was division of labor." Victoria's expression tightened. She recognized herself in his description. What changed? When Emily was 6, she stopped trying to talk to me. Not completely, but the enthusiasm disappeared. She would sign with her mother for hours, these elaborate conversations I could not follow, and when I came home she would just nod and go to her room. I told myself it was a phase, normal kid stuff. Sophie had been watching the conversation, reading their lips. She glanced at her mother with an expression that held years of accumulated disappointment. "It was not a phase," Nathan continued. "She was protecting herself. Every time she tried to communicate with me and failed, every time I pretended to understand or changed the subject or made her feel like a burden, she lost a little more hope. By the time I realized what was happening, she had almost given up on me entirely." Victoria felt the stone in her chest shift. This stranger was describing her own life, her own failures, with the clarity of hindsight she did not yet possess. "What did you do?" "I quit my job. Not immediately, but within a year. I realized that no amount of money was worth losing my daughter. I enrolled in ASL classes, hired tutors, immersed myself in deaf culture. I made every mistake you can imagine. I was patronizing, then overcorrecting, then patronizing in different ways. Emily was patient with me, more patient than I deserved. And now? Nathan's face softened with unmistakable warmth. She is 23, lives in Seattle, works for a nonprofit that advocates for deaf rights. We sign every morning, even though we are in different cities. Video calls, just to check in, share what is happening in our lives. She is my closest friend. Victoria looked at her daughter. Sophie was watching her mother with an expression that contained multitudes. Hope and fear and the guarded skepticism of someone who had been disappointed too many times. 11 years, Victoria said quietly. I have been making excuses for 11 years. I made them for 6. The length does not matter. What matters is when you stop. The announcement board flickered. Their flight had been delayed another hour due to mechanical issues. Victoria barely registered the information. For once, the disruption to her schedule felt almost welcome. More time, more opportunity. Her phone buzzed urgently. She glanced at the screen. An urgent message from her chief operations officer. A crisis requiring immediate attention. The old Victoria would have answered instantly, would have disappeared into the familiar world of problems she knew how to solve. She put the phone back in her bag without responding. Nathan noticed, but said nothing. He understood the significance of that small choice. Every transformation began with a single moment of choosing differently. Sophie had noticed too. She was watching her mother with wide eyes, surprised by the phone's silence. For as long as she could remember, her mother had always answered the phone, always put work first, always disappeared into screens and schedules while Sophie sat nearby, waiting. The delay stretched on. More passengers cycled through frustration and resignation, checking watches, making angry phone calls. But in their small corner of the terminal, something different was happening. Victoria was watching Sophie draw again, but this time she was asking questions. Nathan translated when needed. But increasingly, Sophie found ways to communicate directly with her mother, using simpler signs, facial expressions, written words when necessary. The conversation was halting and imperfect, but it was happening. Sophie showed her mother the full Stellan story, page after page of intricate drawings. Victoria asked about each one, genuinely curious for the first time in years. She wanted to know about the kingdom's history, about the queen's powers, about the enemies Stellan protected against. Nathan watched from nearby, available but not intrusive, understanding that some transformations required witnesses but not participants. After a while, Victoria turned to him again. I feel jealous of you. For understanding her better than I do. For connecting with her so easily. Nathan nodded. That is natural. I felt the same way about my wife, when Emily was young. She could communicate with our daughter, and I could not. It felt like being locked out of my own family. How did you handle it? Badly, at first. I got defensive, made excuses, blamed everyone but myself. It took me a long time to realize that the jealousy was actually good news. It meant I still cared. It meant there was still something worth fighting for. Sophie signed something to her mother, a question. Victoria looked at Nathan. She is asking why you seem sad. Victoria turned to her daughter and tried to respond, fumbling through signs she barely knew. I am not sad. I am thinking. I want to learn. Sophie corrected her hand positions patiently, then signed back. Good. Learning is good. I will help you. Mother and daughter looked at each other, and something passed between them that needed no translation. Victoria's phone buzzed again. She checked the screen briefly, then put it away without responding. She says that is the 4th time you have not answered, Nathan translated. She is surprised. Victoria looked at her daughter. There are some things more important than phone calls. Sophie's expression shifted. became something Victoria had never seen before. Pride. Her daughter was proud of her. The realization was almost more than Victoria could bear. The moment was interrupted by a new notification on Victoria's phone. She glanced at it reflexively, and her expression changed. She pulled the phone out and read through a series of messages, her face growing increasingly troubled. "What is it?" Nathan asked. "A lawsuit. Something from years ago, before I took over the company. We are being sued by a disability advocacy group." She scanned the details, her jaw tightening. "We closed a program that provided employment services for people with disabilities. Budget cuts. The decision was made before my time. But I inherited the consequences." She looked at Sophie, then back at her phone. The connection was suddenly, painfully clear. "People like my daughter," she said quietly. "We closed a program that helped people like my daughter find jobs, find independence, find their place in the world. I never even looked at it. I inherited the policy and never questioned it." Nathan was silent. He understood that some realizations required space, not commentary. Sophie had been watching her mother's face, reading the emotions that played across it. She signed a question. "She is asking what is wrong," Nathan said. Victoria struggled for words. How could she explain that her company, the empire she had built, had caused harm to families like her own? That she had inherited policies she had never examined, priorities she had never questioned. She raised her hands and tried to sign, clumsily. "Work problem. People hurt. I need to fix." Sophie's eyes widened. She understood more than the simple signs conveyed. She signed back, slowly, deliberately. "She is asking if you can help them," Nathan translated. "The people who were hurt." Victoria felt the weight of the question. "I do not know. Maybe. I will have to look at what options we have. It will be complicated." Sophie signed again, more slowly this time. "She says you should try anyway. She says trying is what matters, even when it is hard." Victoria looked at her daughter, really looked, and saw not a child who needed to be protected from difficult realities, but a young person with her own understanding of justice and fairness. Sophie had been navigating a world that often failed to accommodate her. She understood exclusion. She understood what it meant to be overlooked. "I will try," Victoria said. "I promise." Sophie nodded, satisfied with that answer. Then she returned to her sketchpad, leaving her mother to process the weight of the commitment she had just made. Nathan leaned forward. "Can I tell you something?" Victoria nodded. "When I quit banking, everyone thought I was crazy. They said I was throwing away my career, my future, everything I had worked for. But here is what they did not understand. I was not throwing anything away. I was finally picking up what actually mattered." Victoria considered his words carefully. "I cannot quit. The company employs 12,000 people. Their livelihoods depend on decisions I make. I am not suggesting you quit. I am suggesting you decide what kind of leader you want to be. What kind of mother. Those identities do not have to be separate." Sophie looked up from her drawing and signed something to Nathan. "She wants to know if you would practice with her," he translated. "Right now." More signs. Victoria nodded immediately. "Yes, show me." Sophie set aside her sketchpad and turned to face her mother fully. She raised her hands and began a patient, systematic lesson. The sign for mother. The sign for daughter. The sign for love. The sign for try. The sign for learn. Victoria attempted each one, her fingers clumsy and uncertain. Sophie corrected her with the patience of someone who had spent her whole life waiting. Again. Like this. Feel the shape. Nathan watched from nearby, remembering his own first attempts, his own fumbling progress, the years it had taken to become fluent. It had been worth every frustrating moment, every mistake, every time he had wanted to give up, but kept going anyway. The boarding announcement finally came. cutting through the terminal noise. Their flight was ready at last. The long delay was over. Victoria stood and helped Sophie pack her art supplies. Her movements were deliberate, careful, as if she was trying to memorize the weight of each moment. She turned to Nathan. "I do not know how to thank you for everything you have done today. You do not need to thank me, just keep trying. That is all any of us can do." Sophie tugged on her mother's sleeve and signed something elaborate. "She wants to know if she can say goodbye to me properly," Nathan translated. In sign language, Victoria stepped back, giving them space. Sophie turned to Nathan and signed a lengthy farewell, something that involved both hands and took nearly 30 seconds to complete. Her gratitude, her hope, her promise to keep teaching her mother, her wish that Nathan's daughter was happy and healthy. Nathan responded in kind, and Sophie laughed at something in his response. "What did you say to each other?" Victoria asked. Nathan smiled. "She thanked me for talking with her like a real person, not like a problem to be solved, and I told her she has an important job now, teaching her mother, the most important job she will ever have." Victoria felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away, but not quickly enough. Sophie noticed and reached up to wipe her mother's cheek with a gentle hand. Then she signed something simple. "She says it is okay to cry," Nathan translated. "Crying means you care." They gathered their belongings and joined the queue at the gate. As they waited, Victoria made a phone call, speaking intently into the phone. Her expression determined. Sophie watched her mother's face, trying to read the words on her lips. When Victoria hung up, she turned to Sophie and signed slowly and carefully. "I cleared my schedule. 1 month. Just you and me." Sophie's eyes went wide. She looked at Nathan for confirmation. "She means it," he said. Sophie threw her arms around her mother, the first genuine embrace they had shared in years. Victoria held her daughter tightly, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid reality of her small body. The distance between them was not gone, but it was smaller, and it was shrinking. They boarded the plane together. Nathan headed toward economy while Victoria and Sophie settled into first class. But as she buckled her seatbelt, Victoria realized the separation felt different now, less absolute, less permanent. Something had connected them, 3 strangers in an airport, and the connection would remain even as they went their separate ways. Sophie pulled out her sketch pad and began writing. A vocabulary list. Signs for Victoria to learn on the flight. Mother, daughter, love, try, hope, learn, every day, practice. Victoria studied each one, watching Sophie demonstrate the movements, attempting them herself. She got most of them wrong on the first try. Sophie corrected her patiently. Again and again, with the same patient corrections she would offer 1,000 more times over the months and years to come. By the time they reached cruising altitude, Victoria could produce recognizable versions of 15 signs. Not fluency, barely competence, but a beginning. A real beginning. The flight attendant came by with refreshments. Sophie signed her order to her mother. Victoria watched carefully, trying to understand, then tentatively signed back a question to clarify. Sophie repeated the sign, and Victoria got it right. "Apple juice, please," Victoria told the flight attendant. Sophie's smile was worth more than every deal Victoria had ever closed. The plane flew on through the darkening sky. Mother and daughter practiced signs, made mistakes, laughed at errors, tried again. The vocabulary list grew longer. The distance between them grew shorter. By the time they began their descent, Victoria had learned 30 words. Not enough for a conversation, but enough for a beginning. As the wheels touched down, Victoria reached over and signed carefully. "I love you." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. She signed back, "I love you too." Then she added something else, a sign Victoria did not recognize. "What does that mean?" Victoria asked. Sophie demonstrated again. Slowly. Finally, She wrote the translation in her notebook and showed it to her mother. The word was welcome. "Welcome," Sophie signed again, her face bright with emotion. "Welcome to my world." Victoria felt the tears she had been holding back finally spill over. She did not try to stop them this time. Sophie squeezed her hand and smiled, and they sat together as the plane taxied to the gate, mother and daughter, finally beginning to understand each other. They walked through the terminal together, their hands occasionally touching. Victoria did not check her phone. She did not open her laptop. She did not return to the familiar world of schedules and spreadsheets and controlled outcomes. Instead, she walked with her daughter, and when Sophie signed something, Victoria tried her best to understand. Somewhere behind them, in a different part of the terminal, Nathan Cole collected his bag and headed toward the exit. He did not know their names. He would probably never see them again, but he recognized the shape of transformation when he saw it. He had lived it himself, years ago, when a silent daughter had taught him that love without understanding was only half complete. Some stories did not require witnesses for their endings. They simply had to begin, and the rest would follow in its own time. Outside, the evening air was cool and clear. Stars were beginning to appear above the city lights. Victoria looked up at them and thought of Sophie's drawing, the creature called Stellan, the guardian of an imaginary kingdom. Her daughter had been building worlds for years, and Victoria had never bothered to visit them. That was going to change. They climbed into the car together, mother and daughter, and drove off into the night. Sophie signed something as they pulled onto the highway. Victoria did not understand all of it, but she understood enough. Tomorrow. Practice. Together. Yes, Victoria said aloud, then tried to sign the word as well. Tomorrow. And every day after that, Sophie smiled and leaned her head against the window, watching the lights of the city pass by. She had waited 11 years for this moment. Part of her still could not believe it was real, but her mother's hands were learning new shapes, and her mother's eyes were learning to see, and maybe, just maybe, the distance between them would finally close. Victoria drove through the familiar streets, watching her daughter in the rearview mirror. There was so much she did not know, so much she had missed. But the man in the airport had been right. Later was now. She would learn the language. She would enter her daughter's world. She would become fluent in the signs and the culture and the way of being that Sophie had known since birth. It would take years. It would be hard. But she would not stop trying. Not ever. Some transformations happened in an instant. Others took a lifetime. But they all began the same way, with a single moment of choosing differently. A phone call not answered. A lesson accepted. A hand raised in imperfect greeting. Victoria raised her hand from the steering wheel and made the sign for hope. Sophie saw it in the mirror and smiled. They drove on into the night, mother and daughter. The distance between them finally beginning to shrink. She pulled into the driveway of their home, a modest Victorian that had cost more than most people earned in a decade. But the house had never felt like home. Not really. It had felt like a staging area, a place to sleep between meetings and flights and the endless demands of an empire that consumed everything in its path. Victoria wondered if that would change now. She hoped it would. Sophie had fallen asleep during the drive, her head resting against the window, her sketch pad clutched in her hands. Victoria sat for a moment, watching her daughter breathe, marveling at the simple fact of her existence. 11 years. She had been a mother for 11 years, and she was only now beginning to understand what that meant. She reached over and gently shook Sophie's shoulder. Sophie's eyes fluttered open, confused for a moment, then focusing on her mother's face. Victoria raised her hands and signed carefully the words she had learned on the plane. "We are home. I love you. Tomorrow we practice." Sophie smiled sleepily and signed back. "Good. I will teach you." Every day, they walked into the house together, and Victoria did not go to her office. She did not check her email. She did not review the day's missed calls and meetings and decisions that had been made without her. Instead, she sat with her daughter in the living room, and Sophie continued the lesson that had begun in an airport terminal hours before. Sophie taught her the alphabet first, the foundation of everything. 26 letters, each with its own hand shape. Victoria practiced them again and again, her fingers slowly learning to form the unfamiliar shapes. Sophie was patient, correcting without judgment, celebrating small victories with bright smiles. Then came basic words: water, food, sleep, thank you, please, sorry. The vocabulary of daily life, the words Victoria had never bothered to learn because someone else could always translate. But there would be no more translators. From now on, Victoria would speak to her daughter directly, in the language Sophie had known since birth. They practiced until Sophie's eyes began to droop, until the vocabulary list had grown by another 20 words, until the distance between them felt almost bridgeable. When Sophie finally went to bed, Victoria stayed up for another hour, reviewing the signs she had learned, practicing the hand positions, preparing for tomorrow's lesson. Her fingers ached from unfamiliar movements. Her brain felt stretched in new directions. But it was the best she had felt in years, perhaps the best she had ever felt. The next morning, Victoria woke early and practiced more signs before Sophie was even awake. She made breakfast, something she rarely did, and when Sophie came downstairs, she signed good morning with only minor errors. Sophie's face lit up with surprise and delight. They spent the day together, mother and daughter, practicing signs and watching movies with closed captions and looking through Sophie's collection of drawings. Victoria asked questions about every picture, and Sophie answered eagerly, her hands moving with the fluency and expressiveness that Victoria was only beginning to appreciate. In the afternoon, Victoria made phone calls. She enrolled in an intensive ASL course that started the following week. She hired a tutor to supplement the classes. She ordered books and videos and every resource she could find about deaf culture and sign language acquisition. She was approaching this the way she approached everything, with total commitment, with strategic planning, with the determination to succeed. But this time, success meant something different. It meant connection. It meant understanding. It meant finally knowing her daughter, not as a problem to be solved, but as a person to be loved. The weeks that followed were difficult. Victoria made countless mistakes. She signed words backward, confused similar handshapes, struggled with the spatial grammar that made ASL so different from English. There were moments of frustration, moments when she wanted to give up and retreat to the familiar comfort of spoken language. But she kept going. Every morning, she practiced with Sophie before school. Every evening, she attended classes or met with her tutor. Every weekend, she and Sophie spent hours in conversation, building the vocabulary and fluency that Victoria had neglected for 11 years. Sophie bloomed under the attention. The quiet, guarded child Victoria had known began to emerge as someone more confident, more expressive, more fully herself. She shared her stories, her dreams, her fears. She introduced Victoria to her deaf friends from school, who were initially skeptical of the hearing mother who had suddenly decided to learn their language. But as the weeks passed and Victoria's signing improved, their skepticism turned to acceptance, then to something like respect. At work, things changed too. Victoria reinstated the disability employment program her company had closed. She hired consultants to review all their policies for accessibility. She created a new position, a director of inclusion, and filled it with someone from the deaf community who could ensure the company's practices actually served the people they claimed to help. The lawsuit was settled. The advocacy group agreed to drop their case in exchange for the company's commitment to specific, measurable improvements. It cost money, real money. But Victoria no longer counted success in dollars alone. 6 months after that morning in Denver, Victoria stood in her daughter's school auditorium, watching Sophie perform in a sign language poetry recital. Sophie's hands moved through the air with grace and precision, telling a story about a guardian creature who protected a hidden kingdom. Stellan, the character from Sophie's drawings, had become something more. He had become the subject of a poem that Sophie had written and was now performing in front of hundreds of people. Victoria understood every word. Not perfectly, not fluently, but well enough. She felt the emotion behind the signs, the years of imagination and creativity that had gone into creating this world. And when Sophie finished and the audience applauded, hands waving in the deaf tradition instead of clapping, Victoria waved her hands too. Tears streaming down her face. After the recital, Sophie ran to her mother and threw her arms around her. Victoria held her tight and signed into the space between them. "I am so proud of you. You are amazing." Sophie signed back. "Thank you for learning. Thank you for trying. Thank you for being my mom." They walked out of the auditorium together, into the warm spring evening. The distance between them was not gone entirely. 11 years of separation could not be erased in 6 months, but it was smaller now, small enough to bridge with outstretched hands. Victoria thought about Nathan Cole, the stranger in the airport who had changed everything. She had never gotten his contact information, had never been able to thank him properly, but Sophie had found him on social media, had sent him updates on their progress, had shared videos of Victoria's improving signs. He had responded with encouragement and advice, had become a distant mentor in their journey. She thought about his daughter Emily, the 23-year-old who lived in Seattle and called her father every morning. That was the future Victoria wanted. That was the relationship she was building, one sign at a time. Sophie signed something as they walked to the car. "Mom, next summer. Deaf camp. Can I go?" Victoria signed back without hesitation. "Yes. Of course. Whatever you want." Sophie grinned and launched into an excited description of the camp, her hands moving too fast for Victoria to follow completely. But Victoria understood enough, and what she did not understand, she asked Sophie to repeat. To slow down. To teach her. That was the difference now, she asked. She listened. She tried. They drove home through the gathering dusk, mother and daughter, their hands occasionally meeting in the space between the front seats. Victoria did not know what the future held. She did not know if she would ever achieve true fluency, if she would ever be able to communicate with Sophie as easily as Nathan communicated with Emily. But she knew she would never stop trying. Some stories ended with transformation complete, with problems solved, with happily ever after. But this was not that kind of story. This was a story about beginning, about taking the first step on a path that would last a lifetime, about learning, finally, that love without understanding was only half complete. Victoria raised her hand from the steering wheel and signed the word she had learned that first day in the airport, the word that meant more to her now than any word in any language. Hope. Sophie saw the sign in the dim light of the dashboard and smiled. She signed back. Yes. Hope. Always hope. They pulled into the driveway of their home. The lights were on, warm and welcoming, and for the first time in 11 years, Victoria Ashford felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not at the office, not in a boardroom, not on a conference call or a flight to somewhere else. Here, with her daughter, learning to listen at last.